I sat alone in the dim warmth of the forester's hut, nestled deep in the heart of the forest. The single candle I'd lit flickered, its wavering light casting restless shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the wind stirred the treetops, its soft howl punctuated by the occasional creak of wood branches swaying, or perhaps something more. I tried to push the thought aside. This forest had a way of making its presence known even when you tried not to listen. It was just past midnight when I first heard it, a sound from outside, faint but distinct. A rhythmic clop-clop, almost like footsteps, but heavier. Hooves? I froze, my mug of tea halfway to my lips, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. My hand instinctively went to the rifle propped up against the table. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or some stray animal wandering near the hut. Yet, as the seconds dragged on, the noise didn't feel like aimless animal movement. It was deliberate, slow, purposeful. I stood, every creak of the wooden floor beneath me feeling amplified in the silence, and moved toward the small window by the door. My breath fogged the glass as I peered out into the moonlit clearing. Nothing. Just the undisturbed snow and the dark shapes of the trees beyond. The noise stopped. Heart pounding, I stayed at the window for what felt like hours, but was likely only a few minutes. My rational mind begged me to brush it off. Maybe it was a wandering stag, curious but cautious. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Finally, I returned to my chair by the fire, rifle still within reach, and tried to convince myself to sleep. When morning came, the eerie stillness of the forest seemed far less threatening. I had chores to do, and as sunlight spilled across the clearing, the events of the night seemed distant, almost dreamlike. I chalked it up to my imagination, laughing at myself as I stepped outside to fetch water. But then I saw them. Hoofprints. They were sunk deep into the snow, far larger than any deer's tracks I'd ever seen. The prints circled the hut, stopping several times near the window I peered through. My laughter faded as I crouched down, tracing the edges of one of the prints with a trembling finger. The edges of the tracks were crisp, fresh, as if the creature had been there only hours ago. And they weren't shaped like a stag's. They were split, almost like a goat's. But what kind of goat left prints this size? Each step seemed to dig unnaturally deep into the ground, like it carried an impossible weight. A chill crept up my spine as I followed the trail, my breath quickening with each step. The tracks led away from the hut, weaving through the trees in a straight, unnatural line. No meandering like an animal might, it moved with intent. Whatever had been here, it had a purpose. And then, abruptly, the tracks stopped. There was no sign of the creature that made them, no broken branches or disturbed snow beyond that final print. It was as if the thing had vanished into thin air. I stood there, my breath visible in the icy air, staring at the end of the trail. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My skin prickled, and I turned slowly, scanning the dense trees. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The memory of the sound from the night before echoed in my mind, the slow, deliberate clop-clop of hooves on snow. This was no deer. No wandering animal. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew one thing for certain. It would be back. The day dragged on like a heavy cloud, thick and suffocating. I busied myself with the usual chores around the hut, trying to push the unsettling hoofprints and the strange sounds from my mind. But no matter how much I chopped firewood, swept the floors, or mended tools, the sense of unease clung to me like a shadow. The forest seemed quieter than usual that day. Normally, I'd hear the rustle of small animals or the distant chatter of birds, but now there was only the faint groan of the wind. It was as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Each creak of the old hut, each snap of a twig outside, made my nerves jangle. I told myself it was nothing, just the residue of a bad night. By evening, the light began to fade, and the trees outside the clearing grew black and jagged against the deepening twilight. I decided I'd had enough of unanswered questions. I wasn't going to spend another night in restless paranoia, waiting for something to come knocking. If there was something out there, I'd catch it in the act. I rummaged through my gear and found the photo trap, a weathered but reliable camera equipped with motion sensors. It had served me well in the past for tracking game, though I never imagined I'd be using it to hunt, whatever this was. I strapped it to a sturdy birch tree near the edge of the clearing, aiming it toward the hut. If something was circling me at night, I'd catch a glimpse of it by morning. The camera felt like a flimsy shield against the gnawing dread that had settled over me, but it was better than nothing. As I worked, the snow around me glowed faintly in the moonlight, a pale contrast to the inky blackness beyond the trees. My breath curled in the cold air, and for a moment, I paused, listening. Nothing. Just silence. Heavy and oppressive. Satisfied with the camera's placement, I trudged back into the hut, bolting the door behind me. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting just enough light to make the room feel less claustrophobic. But even as I sat down to eat my meager dinner, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. It was as though the forest itself were leaning in, watching me, waiting for something. I tried to distract myself by going over the next day's tasks in my head, repairing the roof, maybe setting some snares farther out, but my thoughts kept circling back to the hoofprints. The memory of how they stopped so abruptly, as if the creature had simply vanished, made my stomach twist. What kind of animal moved like that? Or was it even an animal at all? The hours dragged on, and my mood remained gray, a dull fog of unease that refused to lift. The fire burned low, and I debated whether I should keep it going all night or let it die out. Part of me felt comforted by the light, but another part worried that it might act as a beacon, drawing in whatever had been out there the night before. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slumped onto the narrow cot in the corner. The room was silent except for the faint crackle of the embers and the occasional groan of the wind outside. My eyes drifted shut, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the wooden walls felt like a whisper. Every gust of wind felt like a breath on the back of my neck. Tomorrow, I thought as I finally began to drift off. Tomorrow, I'll check the trap, and maybe I'll have some answers. But deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I woke up with the pale morning light seeping through the cracks in the shutters, casting long, thin beams onto the cold floor of the hut. My back ached from a restless night, and my throat felt dry, but my first thought was of the photo trap. I needed to know what it had captured. Needed to confirm or disprove the uneasy feeling gnawing at me since yesterday. I pulled on my boots and jacket, the chill of the morning air biting at my skin as I stepped outside. The snow crunched underfoot as I made my way to the birch tree where I had set up the camera. It was still there, the lens coated lightly with frost. I took it down carefully, my breath curling in the air as I worked. The tracks from the day before had long since been covered by fresh snow, but the memory of their unnatural size and shape still loomed in my mind. Back inside the hut, I sat at the table, the camera trap in front of me. My hands trembled slightly as I connected it to the small monitor I used to view images. At first, there was nothing, just a series of shots of the empty clearing, the motion sensor triggered by shifting branches or the play of light. But then, as I clicked through, my breath caught in my throat. There it was. The thing was caught in the grainy light of the moon, its form barely contained within the camera's frame. It was standing on two legs, almost human in shape, but grotesquely wrong. Its head was elongated, with curling horns protruding from either side. The face. Oh, God, the face. It was part human, part animal, a snout-like nose, eyes that gleamed like molten silver, and a mouth filled with jagged teeth, bared in a hideous snarl. Its body was wiry but powerful, covered in coarse, matted fur. It stood at least 2 meters tall, and its hands, or were they claws, hung low, tipped with long, sharp fingers. It was staring directly at the hut. At me. My stomach twisted into a knot, and my pulse thundered in my ears. It wasn't a deer or some wandering animal. It wasn't anything natural. This was something else entirely, something ancient, something wild. Something I had no business crossing paths with. I slammed the monitor shut, my hands shaking. I couldn't stay here, not another night. I needed to leave. My sister lived in the city, a few hours' drive away, and I decided right then and there to pack up and head to her. I didn't care if it meant abandoning my post for a few days. Better to face the consequences of that than stay another night with whatever this thing was. I threw my few belongings into a bag, grabbed my keys, and stepped out into the clearing. The forest was eerily quiet again, the snow untouched. My old truck was parked just beyond the hut, its windshield coated in frost. I hurried over, tossing my bag into the passenger seat and sliding behind the wheel. The engine coughed and sputtered as I turned the key, but eventually it roared to life. Relief washed over me. I shifted into gear and started down the narrow path that led out of the forest, the tires crunching over the frozen ground. The trees loomed on either side, their skeletal branches arching overhead like a tunnel. My breath began to steady as I focused on the road ahead. I was getting out. I was going to be safe. But then, something went wrong. The engine sputtered, then choked. The truck shuddered violently, lurching forward before stalling completely. The headlights flickered and died, plunging me into a suffocating darkness. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. "Come on," I muttered, turning the key again. The engine cranked but refused to catch. I tried again. Nothing. That's when I heard it. The sound of something heavy moving through the trees. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching in the snow. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look out the driver's side window. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. But then, a shape emerged from the tree line. It was the creature. The thing from the photos. It stood there, illuminated faintly by the pale light of the moon, its silver eyes fixed on me. And then it moved. It took a step forward, then another, each one slow and purposeful. I fumbled for the door handle, my fingers clumsy with panic, and managed to wrench it open. I stumbled out into the snow, the cold biting through my clothes as I backed away from the truck. The creature kept coming, its movements fluid and unnatural, like it didn't belong in this world. "Stay back," I shouted, but my voice cracked with fear. My rifle was still in the hut, useless now. All I had were my feet and the blind hope that I could outrun it. But as I turned to run, I heard the clop-clop of its hooves quicken, and a low, guttural growl filled the air behind me. And I knew there was no escaping it. The moment I turned to run, the creature gave a guttural snarl that sent a jolt of terror down my spine. The sound was almost unnatural, like a low rumble mixed with a wet, animalistic growl. I pushed forward through the snow, my boots crunching with each frantic step. The cold air burned my lungs, and my breath came out in ragged bursts, but I didn't dare stop. Not with that thing behind me. The sound of its hooves pounding against the frozen ground grew louder, closer. I could hear its breathing now, heavy, savage, and eager, like it was enjoying the chase. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my stomach dropped. It was faster than I thought, its wiry frame bounding through the snow with terrifying grace. Its silver eyes gleamed with predatory glee, locked onto me. My foot caught on a buried root, and I stumbled, crashing hard into the snow. Pain shot through my knees and hands as I scrambled to get up, but the creature was already on me. I barely had time to roll to the side as it lunged, its sharp claws slicing through the air where my head had been a second earlier. I lashed out instinctively, kicking at its legs, and felt my boot connect with its bony shin. It staggered slightly but didn't fall. Instead, it let out a high-pitched screech of fury and swiped at me again. I raised my arm to block it, but its claws tore through the sleeve of my jacket and raked across my forearm. The pain was blinding, hot and searing, but adrenaline pushed me to keep moving. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a thick branch half buried in the snow. It wasn't much, but it was something. The creature snarled and lunged again, and I swung the branch with every ounce of strength I had. The wood cracked against its head, and the creature reeled back, dazed. For a moment, I thought I had a chance. But then it straightened, shaking its head like a dog shrugging off water, and fixed its glowing eyes on me. It growled low in its throat, crouching like a predator ready to pounce. And it did. It leapt at me with a speed I couldn't match, slamming into my chest and knocking me to the ground. The impact drove the air from my lungs, and its claws tore at my sides as I fought to push it off. I managed to twist my body just enough to shove it away, but not before its jaws snapped at my hand. I barely had time to register the searing pain before I realized it wasn't just a bite. My hand was gone. Blood poured from the mangled stump of my wrist, steaming in the freezing air. I screamed, more from the shock than the pain, and pressed my arm against the snow, trying to slow the bleeding. The creature circled me, its snarl curling into something that resembled a grin. It was toying with me, savoring its victory. But I wasn't done yet. I crawled backward through the snow, one hand pressed against the wound, the other clawing at the ground. My mind screamed for me to give up, to lie still and let the cold take me, but some stubborn, primal instinct refused to let me quit. I wasn't going to die like this, not without a fight. The hut wasn't far. If I could make it back, if I could get to the rifle. The creature lunged again, but I rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding its claws. I used the momentum to push myself forward, crawling as fast as I could toward the faint outline of the hut in the distance. My vision blurred, the edges darkening as blood loss and exhaustion began to take their toll. But the thought of that rifle, the solid, dependable weight of it in my hands, kept me going. The creature growled behind me, its patience wearing thin. I felt its breath on the back of my neck, hot and rancid, but I didn't look back. My fingers brushed against the frozen wooden steps of the hut, and I heaved myself up, dragging my body through the door. The creature slammed into the side of the hut just as I slammed the door shut, bolting it with my good hand. It wouldn't hold for long. I crawled toward the rifle propped against the wall, leaving a smear of blood in my wake. My vision was narrowing now, the edges turning black, but I forced myself to keep moving. The creature was already pounding on the door, the wood creaking and splintering under its weight. My fingers wrapped around the cold steel of the rifle, and I turned just as the door burst open. Snow and splinters flew into the room as the creature barreled in, its silver eyes gleaming with rage. With the last of my strength, I raised the rifle and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the small space, and the recoil jolted through my body. The creature let out a horrific, otherworldly scream as the bullet tore into its chest. It staggered, clawing at the wound, before collapsing onto the floor. I stared at its body, gasping for breath, my head swimming with pain and exhaustion. I didn't dare look away, not until I was sure it wasn't getting back up. And then, everything went black. I woke up to the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder mingling with the faint metallic tang of blood. The hut was eerily silent, save for the faint creak of the wind pressing against the wooden walls. My body ached, and my head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pulse. I groaned, struggling to sit up, my hand, or what was left of it, burning with pain. The rifle was still in my lap, the barrel cold against my leg. But when I glanced around the room, the creature was gone. The splintered door hung open, letting in the icy morning air and a soft dusting of snow. My bloodstains painted a grim trail across the floor, but there was no sign of the beast. No body. No tracks leading out. It was as if it had simply disappeared. Yet I could feel its presence lingering, a heavy weight in the air, as if it was still watching me from somewhere unseen. I couldn't stay here any longer. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from this cursed forest as I could. Ignoring the searing pain in my arm, I grabbed a roll of bandages from the small first aid kit near the fireplace and did my best to wrap the stump of my wrist. The bleeding had slowed, but the pain was relentless, sharp and jagged with every heartbeat. I staggered out into the clearing, the snow crunching beneath my boots. My truck sat where I'd left it, its windows frosted and the engine quiet. For a moment, I hesitated, scanning the tree line. The forest stood still, the shadows between the trees deep and impenetrable. But I could feel something out there, hidden just beyond sight. Watching. Waiting. I climbed into the truck, tossing the rifle onto the passenger seat, and turned the key. The engine sputtered and groaned, but after a few agonizing seconds, it roared to life. Relief flooded through me, and I pressed my foot to the gas, eager to leave the forest behind. The narrow dirt road stretched out before me, winding through the trees. I drove as fast as the icy terrain allowed, my good hand gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles ached. The world outside the truck felt distant, unreal, like a half-remembered nightmare. But the bandaged stump on my wrist was a harsh reminder that this wasn't a dream. I thought of my sister, her warm apartment in the city, the smell of coffee brewing in her kitchen. The thought of her brought a flicker of hope, a fragile thread to cling to. I just had to make it there. Just a few more hours, and I'd be safe. But as the forest thinned and the road began to widen, I heard it. The roar. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, a low, guttural bellow that seemed to shake the very air around me. My stomach dropped, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The forest behind me was still, the road empty, but the sound lingered, echoing in my ears. It wasn't a cry of pain or defeat. It was a promise. A warning. I pressed the gas pedal harder, the truck lurching forward as the tires skidded briefly on the icy road. The roar faded into the distance, but the fear it left behind stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the creature wasn't done with me. As the trees gave way to open fields and the first signs of civilization appeared on the horizon, I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. The city wasn't far now. My sister's apartment was waiting. Safety was waiting. But in the back of my mind, I knew I'd never truly escape. The forest would call me back someday. And when it did, I knew the creature would be waiting.